Please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Amen. Please be seated. When I was an elementary school-aged kid, my mom lived in what was then a pretty small town in eastern Oregon called Bend. Now, Bend is sort of like a little Los Angeles combined with Vail, but back in the day, it was like a brew pub, some hippies, people who liked to camp, and guys who stockpiled I don't know what. She lived in an unincorporated part of that particular county, and they had a big acre that was behind their house. When my sister and I first went there to see this house, I was not impressed. Bend is in what's called high desert. It's dry. It's arid most of the year. Its elevation is pretty high, which means in the winter it gets snow. Well, the snow was kind of neat, but the summers were not so neat. I thought how ugly everything looks. The sage plants are sort of this dusty gray-green, and the junipers are sort of darker, dusty gray-green. Even the berries were dusty blue. I didn't like it until it rained. I have a distinct memory of the first time I was there in the desert and the rain began to patter, and Mom said, "Do you smell that? It's the best smell in the world. The smell when the rain begins to hit the dry earth." Within hours, things began to bloom. The sagebrush that I had thought so little of began to have these beautiful yellow flowers. Flowers of all kinds, in fact, began to appear in what I thought was sort of a dry and unattractive land. Really interesting little creatures began to hop out and crawl out of the mud and come out looking for a little air, a little water, a little food. It was so amazing. It just, what looked to me like a dead place became fully alive. Now, I understand now that the desert is not a dead place, that it is fully alive. And as an adult, I have grown to appreciate the severe, hard beauty of a desert. But I think the metaphor is strong. The prophet Isaiah promises us that the desert shall rejoice. And every time I read that line, I think about that time when the rain began to hit, flowers began to bloom, and the animals came out. The desert shall rejoice. What a powerful promise. Now, for Isaiah, who we have been walking with during these weeks of Advent, what was promised, what was believed, is that the new King David was going to appear. Remember King David? A not uncomplicated person who rode into Jerusalem with his band of kind of outlaw army, was able to defeat his arch nemesis Saul, and was able then to lay the groundwork for worshiping Yahweh in Jerusalem like the right way, to move the Ark of the Covenant in, and that his son Solomon would then take over and build the grandest temple in the world. That was David. So you can imagine how John the Baptist might have felt. That the promise was not someone who was going to come with mercy, but someone who was going to come with justice. John the Baptist, who had at that time even a bigger following than Jesus. John the Baptist, who we met last week. John the Baptist, who was the person that people would flock to from all over. Rich and poor alike came looking for the mercy of atonement, looking for the mercy that comes with repentance, looking for the forgiveness that comes with the baptism, with the washing. Make me clean. Wash me and I shall be whiter than snow, says the psalmist. So you can imagine how frustrating, how heartbreaking it might have been for John. John, it says, was in prison, which often happens to people who speak a lot of truth to power. I think about what's happening in Hong Kong now, for example. People speaking truth to power and people disappearing. John's in prison. We cannot assume that Herod's prison is a 5-star hotel with concierge service. When I was in Jerusalem, we went to the place where we thought maybe Jesus had been held overnight in a prison, and it was really just a hole, a cave and a hole in the ground. It's a terrible place. His disciples come and visit him. I assume they're bringing him food and water and news. It's probably the only care he's going to get. Prison in those days wasn't a place where you went and you stayed for the rest of your life. Prison was just a holding place until the end. So John knows that his end is coming, that his personal end is near. What do we do when we can see that the distance between now and the end is not so great? If I were John, I'd probably be reviewing my life's work. All those years in the desert, all those locusts and honey. Was it worth it? Was he preparing for the right one? I can imagine the anxious feeling behind the question that his disciples go out, are you the one, or should we be looking for someone else? Because what they're expecting is that King David to come back in with the soft robes and the big sword. They're expecting someone who is going to meet the violence of empire with the violence of rebellion. That's a tough nut to crack, really. Justice is something that we long for. Justice is something that each of us wants dearly. When things happen to us that are not our fault, that harm us egregiously, we want, need, and I would even say deserve justice. I listen to a lot of true crime podcasts, and part of the reason I love them is that I have a feeling that justice is being served somehow by telling the stories of victims and making the perpetrators into these sort of monstrous bad guys. I want justice, except when it comes to my own shortcomings and failures, and then I want mercy. John wants justice, and what he gets is mercy. Jesus says to the disciples of John, he says, well, tell John what you see. The blind see, the deaf hear, the lame walk, the dead are risen back to life. I don't know. Does that make me a Messiah? We long for justice, except when it comes to us. We long for mercy, except when it goes out to the other guy. What do? It's paradox. Two things encountering each other that are both equally true and cannot exist at the same time. And that's where we are in this reading. John down in his hole, wondering, was my life's work worth it? I wonder if any of us have ever experienced that same feeling. Was my life's work worth it? When I'm down in my hole, I just think, what am I even doing here? What have I been doing for the last insert number of years? And I think, I need God to come in here and fix this. Come down and fix it, God. That's what the psalmist says. Come down here and fix this. That's what Isaiah promises. God's coming back and he is going to fix this. He is going to say, I got it, big sword, kick butt, take names. Blind see, the deaf hear, and the lame walk, the dead are raised. I'm going to pause there and mention that it's Advent 3, my favorite Sunday of the year. Gaudete. Bev looked at my socks this morning, my pink socks with the cats. She thought for a minute I had said Gato Day. Gaudete Sunday. Gaudete, Latin word that means rejoice. It comes from the old days, the really old days, when Advent was not 4 weeks of sort of quiet internal preparation, but it was sort of 7 weeks of remembering that you're going to die and be judged and held accountable for all the wrong things you've ever done. It was a penitential season, a season of fasting. We don't do it that way anymore, thank God. But we still have this Gaudete Sunday, this Sunday of rejoicing. In the old days, it was a lightening, a lessening, a relieving of sort of the penitential culture. Today, we think that it's a time when we remember that whatever else is going on, however long the wait is, however much patience we have to invest in wanting God to get down in the hole with us and fix it, that we hold out hope. Now, that's tough. At least it's tough for me. Holding out hope. We talked about hope a few weeks ago. Hope is not really hope if it feels like a foregone conclusion. Hope, if it's just sort of wish fulfillment thinking, is not so much hope. We start out with hope, like the children in our children's chapel made our sign. And we realize that hope requires some faith to keep it going. But hope also requires joy. So where do we find our joy when we're down in the hole? Where do we find that joy? The promise of God is that we are not alone. The promise of God is that this moment, no matter how bad it feels, is not the end. If we're in the hole, this is not the end of the road. I love what Jesus says, kind of the kicker, as he sends John's disciples back to him. And blessed is the man who takes no offense at me. The promise of God is that mercy is abundant and for us. We think we want justice, and we do. We do. And that is a good and right thing to want. If you've ever been the kid in a classroom where the teacher was gone, and the kid that just starts to get a little too crazy, just kind of butting up into Lord of the Flies territory, and then the actual adult walks in the room, you know how good it feels when justice enters the system. But we also want mercy. We want to be healed, most of all. We want the things that hurt us to be taken away and lifted. And that, my friends, is the promise of Jesus. The promise of healing. The promise of renewal. The promise that the most impossible, unpredictable thing is in fact possible, is in fact happening. We expect to see the new David coming down the road sometimes. But then it turns out that Jesus is the one we were really waiting for. We expect that someone will come and punish our foes. But as anyone who's ever lived through kind of a civil war or rebellion can tell you, what seems like a rebellion of justice often turns into something else. What we need is justice that can kiss mercy. What I love about this story is that Jesus reminds us not only of the work that he is doing in the world, the skin and bones Jesus, the Jesus with flesh on, the God with us that was promised, but that the justice that we need is already happening. That someone is going to bear the weight of everything that has happened. And give us the opportunity to start all over again. And I also love that he says no matter how great any one human being is, God is greater still. That for me is a place where I put my hope. That for me is what lights my faith. And that for me is the source of joy. Joy does not have to be an overwhelming feeling. It doesn't have to be the happiness that a kid experiences opening up presents under the tree. Joy can be something deeper. During Advent, I have talked not so much about the 10 things that you can do to live a holier life, but rather how in the life that we're living, we can make ourselves more open to God's presence, more open to healing through our practices, our basic practices. Hope, faith, even joy. Those are practices. Noticing where even the smallest flame of joy might be in our own lives. Light shines in the darkness, and darkness cannot overcome it. Our God is the God of the unexpected beauty. Our God is the God that makes even the deadest, driest seeming place bloom with life again. In this season of Advent, my prayer is that each of us would be able to notice the places where life blooms, where light shines, and where Christ is present, right there with us, wherever we are. In the name of God, amen.